Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole, the 4th District of Oklahoma. This is another one of our congressional chats. This has been a week in the House, at least, where there's been a lot of motion, but frankly, not much movement. The big focus, given the tragedies that we had in Uvalde, Texas, and Buffalo, New York, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, amongst others, has been on the issue of gun control. In the Senate, there's actually been a serious discussion about that. And we'll wait and see what the senators come up with, but there is a real give and take about what can really be done that would make a difference. And they're seriously talking about not just gun control, but things like mental health, things like hardening the targets of schools, making them safer, and also some modest gun regulation issues as well. In the House, the Democrats chose to do precisely the opposite. They never engaged Republicans, never talked about any of the root causes of the problem. They just simply went right after guns. And the ultimate aim on their side is to get rid of AR-15, semi-automatic weapons, to make it more difficult to get a handgun, frankly, penalize the 99.9% of gun owners who acquire firearms legally and use them responsibly. That's not an acceptable solution. Look, we know that there's a lot more at work here. Guns have always been relatively plentiful in American society. That's true from the very beginning of our country, and it's always been true. The change has been in the social conditions and the deeper culture. Those things are hard to legislate and difficult to talk about, but the reality is that's where we ought to be looking. On the Senate side, they're trying to do that. On the House side, it's simply been one unacceptable piece of legislation after another. They very narrowly pass a Democratic-controlled House. Everybody on the floor knows they will never pass the United States Senate in a 50-50 split or as long as the filibuster exists. So what you're seeing on the House floor all week long is simply an exercise in messaging. It's not an effort to find common ground. It's not an effort to come to a meaningful solution. So that's disappointing. We'll wait and see what the Senate produces. That might be something that might be acceptable to the majority in both chambers, although I will be very skeptical, quite frankly, as I look at any legislation on this issue. The second thing that's happened in the House is something you don't see much and you don't hear about much, but it's actually very important because it points to a failure of the majority. The Democrats used what's called a rule vote. That's simply a vote on a piece of legislation that controls how many amendments can be allowed on a particular bill, how much time will be debated, whether or not there are points of order that can be accepted against the bill. And they put in there a budget provision, something that they quote unquote deemed as passed. But in other words, they passed the budget not by bringing it through the budget committee, not by having a debate on the floor, but by simply writing it in secret, taking basically the president's numbers and deeming that. That is, if you vote for the rule, you voted for the budget, whether you meant to or not. They know no Republicans will vote for a Democratic rule, and all of their members have to vote for the rule. And so you end up with a budget that's been written basically in the Speaker's office and which has not gone through the normal process of give and take. That's a really bad thing to do. Number one, because nobody is actually invested in making sure that budget works. And number two, it shows the majority simply cannot pass a budget on its own. It's been since 2009 that a Democratic majority has actually moved a budget out through the budget committee and then across the floor. Their own party is so divided, they simply can't write a budget. And frankly, when you're dealing with a huge national debt, an annual national deficit, and if you can't come to grips and at least present a plan to the American people and pass it through a committee that you control, then you're just simply not doing your job. We hear a lot of talks about the divisions on Capitol Hill. This is one that's not about division, it's about dysfunction. And it is about division within the majority caucus. Again, no Democrat ever votes for a Republican budget. No Republican ever votes for a Democratic budget. But in this case, Democrats can't even get together around a common solution themselves and actually move something forward through the House and operate by it. That's something that ought to deeply trouble people that are actually concerned about the debt. Let me end with this. While it's been a difficult week in Congress, it's been a very difficult time, obviously, for the country. I do see some things moving ahead. I do see appropriations hearings happening. I do think you'll see in July most of the appropriations bills move across the House floor. You'll begin to see them move out of committee later this month. That's a good thing. It'll be a pretty partisan process at the beginning, but at the end, it sets us up for a deal later this fall between Democrats, Republicans, and the White House to hopefully get the government funded for the next year without any risk of a shutdown. I also continue to see some bipartisan measures that can work. So while this week has been difficult in the House because the gun issue has not been approached constructively and because the budget has not been dealt with responsibly, don't lose hope that the system can't work. It can. But probably we need to get back to a situation, honestly, where we have a divided government again, where we have some check on the executive and certainly a check on this Democratic majority, and go from there. With that, look forward to visiting with you next week. I'm sure it'll be an eventful week. They all are up here, particularly as we approach an election. But be safe, look after your family, and God bless you all.